and somebody said, I think you should really turn this into a deck building game. I see this game as a deck builder. And so I started trying to turn it into a deck builder before going, what the heck? There's not a deck builder here. Deck building is a great mechanism that has nothing to do with this game.
Welcome to Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I'm super excited to be here today with Connie Vogelmann to find out how Apiary was created. But first, let's jump into a brief overview of how Apiary works. Apiary is a competitive worker placement hive building game for 1 to 5 players. Each player controls one of 20 unique factions and starts the game with a hive, a few resources, and worker bees. During the game, you explore planets, gather resources, develop technologies, and create carvings to demonstrate your faction's strengths, which is measured in victory points. When your worker bees are removed from the board, they level up in strength and eventually hibernate. The game ends when all sections of the hibernation comb are filled for the corresponding player count, and the player with the most victory points wins. Hi, Connie. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't wait to talk about Apiary.
Cool. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you too. When I first heard about Apiary, I was like, this theme of bees in outer space had me super intrigued. And then I looked at the box cover art, and it's stunning. And I'm like, okay, now I really need to see what this is all about. And then after playing it, I really dig it. And I love how it's this medium worker placement game with such a unique theme and so much variety. And also, I'm always excited to see more female designers. So it's really good to have you here. And I am very, very curious, what initially inspired you to create Apiary?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will admit I tend to be a mechanism first game designer, and was having a conversation with some friends about worker placement games. And we were talking about how, in a lot of cases, the decision of whether or not to get a new worker isn't as exciting as it should be. You want it to be this really compelling decision. But in an awful lot of games, there's kind of a pre-programmed, you get a new worker until X round, or maybe you get 1 new worker in the game or 2 new workers or something like that.
Right.
And I was thinking that wasn't as interesting of a decision as it should be. And so we had, I think, just played Village, which includes, it's a worker placement game by Inka and Marcus Brand that has this concept of worker death. Essentially, you're taking, actions, the actions cost time. And then basically every time you cross a little bridge on this little time track that you have, one of your workers has to die. And so I think this was sort of thinking about those two things together and thinking, man, wouldn't it be interesting if you had a worker pool where that was a dynamic pool where you had workers kind of coming in and coming out over the course of the game? What would that look like? And then from there, it just instantly clicked with oh my gosh, this is how honeybees work. I mean, I had been, my grandpa used to keep bees, so I'd sort of grown up with it. And then I have bees now. So I was kind of getting into that process at the time. And so the two things just kind of clicked together. So that's where Apiary came from.
That is so awesome. And I never even made that connection of Village kind of having that similar mechanism, but that's super cool. So how did you get from that initial idea into a playable prototype?
Badly. So it's actually kind of embarrassing to think through those early prototyping efforts, but I also want to be very upfront about it because we got to, I think, what ended up being a very good game through very bad methods, in all honesty. So I don't recommend it. I recommend that people do as I say, not do as I do. Because I wasn't in the design community at that point in time. I was a board game player and kind of floundered my way in. And so I literally made the first 20 versions of Apiary in Microsoft Word.
Okay.
You can do it. It's not an efficient way to do it. Word doesn't do great with layering lots of images over each other. Then, of course, you're editing everything by hand. The other thing that I did a lot of, which was terrible, was I was, laminating all of my pieces. And I was spending hours and hours and hours trying to make this really beautiful prototype, only to basically throw it in the trash. I mean, I tend to iterate very quickly and I tend to iterate very aggressively. So between version, 10 and version 11, I'm probably throwing out or recycling, 95% of my components, something like that. And so it was very, very
Wow.
inefficient.
Yeah. So you were
So
using paper for
yeah.
everything? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Okay.
this was sort of pre-COVID when I was starting working on this, and so I think the iterating on Tabletop Simulator or any of the other programs that have sprung up since then wasn't as big of a deal back then. So yeah, I was doing it all on paper
Sure.
and doing it frankly very very inefficiently. So I just always have to put in a plug for Nandeck, Nandeck. Every single time I talk about any game, it's just that thing is a life changer and a lifesaver and absolutely wonderful program for iterating. You basically type all of your information into an Excel spreadsheet, hit go, and then it generates all your cards. I mean, it's just life changing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I use the Mac equivalent of Nandeck, and
Yeah.
yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. So eventually, I'm assuming you got into creating a more functional prototype somehow. Was it when you started using Nandeck?
No, so I actually kept using Word for until almost I started working with Stonemaier on it. I mean, I was stubbornly stuck with it for an incredibly long time. But what did happen is I did end up falling into a group of DC game designers. Elizabeth was leading the group at the time, Elizabeth Hargrave, and then it also had a lot of other great
Cool.
designers, Matthew O'Malley, Dominic Grimfichetts, like a lot of the other like local DC designers. And so that was actually when I really started kind of getting focus because I think the first few versions of Apiary, maybe the first dozen or two versions of Apiary, I didn't have a lot of focus. I didn't quite know what I wanted it to be. And so it tended to vacillate
Ah.
really drastically back and forth. And so I think it was finally when I started connecting with that group that I really got a good sense of the vision and where I wanted the game to go. And that was when it really started making a lot of progress.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's great that you found that like kind of community of game designers that, could help each other and, with playtesting and mentorship and everything like that. That's awesome.
It made a
Sounds
really
like you're
huge
in the right
difference.
place.
Yep. Yep. And I think about that all the time that I was just incredibly, incredibly lucky because there's just a lot that you're going to get from experience and that you can learn from other experienced designers that take a long time if you're, if ever, to figure out on your own. And so I was very, very lucky to find that group.
Awesome. So what was like either early on or, after you started kind of working with Stonemaier, what was your like playtesting process like for Apiary?
Yeah, so it definitely got refined a lot over the process because I think when I was first starting to run playtests on my own, I remember this was back in maybe March of 2019, something like that. I'd been working on the game for maybe 2 months at most. And I remember taking it to a convention and somebody said, I think you should really turn this into a deck building game. I see this game as a deck builder. And so I like started trying to turn it into a deck builder before going, what the heck? Like there's not a deck builder here. Like deck building is a great mechanism that has nothing to do with this game. And so I do think that figuring out how to run playtests is a skill, and that's definitely something that I developed over time. And a lot of that is reading the facial expressions on your playtesters, figuring out what they're confused by, what they're struggling with. I think playtesters often don't know how to fix something, but when they identify a problem, I feel like they're almost always right. I mean, every once in a while, it's a one-off problem that's unique to that person, but 95% of the time, if somebody's mad by something, if they're frustrated by something, if something feels bad, that's a reflection of the game and not the playtester. And so I think
Mm.
the other thing too is I think setting really clear expectations at the beginning of each playtest is really, really critical. I mean, this is an early prototype. It might crash and burn. If it crashes and burns, we're going to make some changes on the fly. If you see something and it doesn't make any sense, give it to me so I can see what it is and then throw it out, and sort of
Right.
setting those expectations as to where you are in the process, I think makes a really big difference. And then once the game got signed with Stonemaier, I mean, they have an incredible blind playtester network. And so we did, I think, 6 different waves of playtesting, and each wave goes to somewhere between like 5 and 7 or something like that lead playtesters. And then the lead playtesters organize several playtests. And then they fill out a Google survey after every single playtest with just kind of what worked, what didn't work, how did you like this session, how long did it take, kind of like data. And then they would also
Cool.
submit a several page long report after the end of all 3 sessions, basically talking about some of the more qualitative stuff. And then basically after each one of those waves came back, Jamie Stegmaier would sort of pull out the things that he thought were the most critical, summarize them in an email, maybe provide some solutions, maybe just sort of say, what do you think? And then he would send me all of the files and all of the reports, and then I would pour through them. And then usually what would happen is I would have quite a bit of back and forth with Jamie on sort of troubleshooting, problem solving, that kind of stuff. Take it, do some more play tests myself, and then send it back to Jamie. He would try it, and then he'd send it out for another wave of play testing. And then we did that about, I think, 6 times.
Wow. And how long do you know, like, about how long that all took?
I will admit that when I had the game, it took me a little while. I may have taken a year off for the pandemic. And so I ended up, yeah, I mean, it was a weird time. But I brought it to the game to Stonemeier's Design Day in in the September of 2021, and then ended up signing it with Stonemaier in, I believe, November 2021. And then that iterating and blind playtesting process took somewhere around maybe 6 to 8 months, something like that.
Gotcha.
And that was, after I had basically made it the best game I possibly could, and then sent it to Stonemaier, and then we did that, maybe 8 months or so of development after that.
Yeah. Wow, cool. So at what point did you start like documenting the rules for Apiary?
Yeah, that was a good question. I know you sent it to me ahead of time, and I was thinking about it, and I don't have a good answer for that, to be honest with you, because it
No
was
worries.
so haphazard. I think I ended up writing the rules way too early, to be honest with you, because I remember writing and rewriting them like a dozen times, and that's obviously
Gotcha.
not a very efficient use of time. I think what I would say, like for sort of forward-looking advice, that it's good to make some amount of documentation, especially if you anticipate that you might not play the game for a month, because you will forget, or at least I will forget. And so I think it's important to at least write down enough that what's going on. But I think that in terms of more coherent rule books, I would wait until fairly late in the process. Maybe not when you're going to be sending it out to, blind or unguided playtesters, but close to that point in time. One of the things, though, that I will flag, and I think it's really a useful exercise, rulebook writing, because a lot of times it will tell you the problems in your game. Because if you can't figure out how to write it, it's going to trip people up. And that's, I think, kind of a good lesson, is that if I'm staring at a page for 25 minutes and I can't figure out how to explain an edge case, like I probably just need to design that edge case out of there.
Right. What would you say was the biggest challenge you faced during either while you were designing Apiary or developing?
Yeah, absolutely. So outside of some of the like me being directionless and needing to find a direction, which I would call a challenge of a sort, a couple of other sort of mechanical things in particular. One was the aging and dying of the workers. I started out with D6s, so the workers would have to age, 6 times, and that was way too slow. And so kind of trying to design around that, I spent, a fairly long amount of time trying to figure out how to make that work, and it just didn't. So that's one piece of it.
Right.
Another piece of it was figuring out the bump mechanism. That was not something that I found to be particularly easy. And I had a lot of different versions of it and a lot of different iterations. And a lot of times it was like your worker would get bumped off the space, and then it would go into some kind of a common pool, and then you'd retrieve it from the space. Was pretty challenging. In addition to like having the numbers mean something, because obviously in the current version, the number is associated with the strength of the action you can take, and trying to figure out that puzzle really took quite a lot of time. So that was one of a couple of the harder things.
Did you always have the bump mechanism, or was it ever at a point like more just straight up worker placement, place, get them back, place?
That's a good question. It was never straight up worker placement. I think from the beginning, I sort of had this concept of, they're bees, right? And the move to space changed later, but from the first version of the game, they were bees. And so blocking never made a lot of sense to me. We had also played a lot of Charterstone, which is the Jamie Stegmaier designed legacy game that uses a bumping mechanism. And so that was something that I was always considering. It was not in every version of the game, and it did vary around there, but I didn't ever have worker placement spots blocked. That was never something that seemed to fit with the game.
Gotcha. Outside of solving like, hey, I want these bees to go to level 4, and the bumping and everything, were there any other aha moments you kind of stumbled upon?
Well, one of the really late aha moments actually came in development, and this Jamie gets all the credit for this one. But one of the things he really, really wanted was for the 4 bees. The strength 4 bees are the most powerful bees; they can take the best actions. He wanted the strength 4 bees to do something special in every single action spot. So we had for a while. We had, you can get the best buildings, like the ones that are most important for victory points. You could get those with the strength 4 bees. We had the seed cards that you can essentially tuck under your mat, and you could do that with a 4. But some of the other strength 4 actions actually were added pretty late, and that was something that Jamie really wanted because he really wanted that kind of tension. So like you didn't know what you wanted. You were pulled in a lot of different directions, and I think that is one of the best
Yeah.
parts of the game. That again was added very, very late.
Oh, that's really cool. I already mentioned like I love that box cover art that Quan Chai did, but the graphic design is also like so fantastic, and I love how the game board, like everything is so easy to read, and it just looks really eye pleasing and interesting. But it's also really functional. So, how were the
Mm-hmm.
art and graphic design decisions made?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of that's Stonemaier. So when basically the day that they signed the game, Jamie said, "Hey, do you have any artists in mind? I want to get on the art. I have somebody in mind. His name's Kwanchai Moria. At which point you just kind of do a spit take, right? But is there somebody else you'd want?" And I'm like, no, because so by this point I should mention by this point we'd moved it to space. That was part of the pre-signing sort of discussion with Stonemaier.
Oh yeah, oh
Jamie
yeah.
So it was bees when I had initially kind of reached out to them about the game, and then later Jamie was sort of like, "Hey, I'm a little worried about this theme. Honey Buzz just came out, which is a midweight worker placement game featuring honeybees. Would you consider putting a
Mhm.
sci-fi twist on the game?" And I said, "Absolutely." So by this point, the game was in space, and so Quantum Moria just seemed like such a good fit that I was like, "Absolutely." um,
Yeah,
but then,
yeah.
but then, Quantai really ran with it, and as did Jamie, and I didn't really see the art until it was pretty close to finished. I love it. It's absolutely wonderful. I wish I could take some kind of credit for some kind of hand in it somewhere, but I really can't. And then Stonemaier has basically a staff graphic designer. I think she was on contract for a while and is now just employed by them and does the graphic design for all of their games. And I'll flag too that one of the big kind of mantras I think with Stonemaier is making their games very accessible and making that onboarding very, very easy and providing things like there's a teaching guide in Apiary that's like a one page, here's how you teach the game and stuff like that. And so I think that makes their games a lot more accessible in a really wonderful way.
Totally, totally. So, when and how did you come up with the name Apiary?
Yeah, that was really early, to be honest with you. I think the very first prototype had the name apiary. And it's the definition is a collection of beehives. And from one of the other kind of core elements of the game that stayed from the very beginning to the very end was this idea of hive building. Each of you are building out a hive, and it's like, well, what's a collection of beehives? It's an apiary, and it's kind of a fun word. It's not something that's
Yeah.
necessarily in everyone's vocabulary, but I think it's when you I kind of did a Google search, and I was like, okay, there's no game that has any kind of a name that's anything similar, so it sort of stands out. And so I think it just kind of stuck. I'm generally terrible at naming things, but for whatever reason that one seemed to work out pretty well. And then I thought for a while once we moved it to space that we might change the name, and then I think we just liked it, so we just kept it.
Very cool. And speaking of the hives, one of the cool things about Apiary is that you have all these different hive mats that you can start with, and it kind of gives everybody this asymmetry when you're playing. How was the develop? Did that come during development? Like after you came up with the like let's do the outer space kind of
Yeah,
theme with the
yeah.
bees?
So yeah, and I will say that I for a very long time I had a much more punishing version of the hive mats that no one liked. And that was basically that, yeah, one day I'm going to design a game with this because I really like it, but it basically was you had to build out your hive. Your hive was your storage space, and then every time you built a tile in it you covered up your storage space, so there was always this kind of push pull of,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, what do you want now versus later, and how close can you cut your storage and all that. And I really like that, but everyone else is like, this sucks, it's not very fun. So yeah, so we actually took that mechanism out for a while, and then it kind of came back. It was actually a playtester suggestion. One of the blind playtesters for Stonemaier said, "Hey, I really like Arc Nova. Have you considered sort of a similar mat to that?" And it's like, yeah, that's probably the solution that I was looking for before with the expansion and the storage.
yeah, yeah. Having varied hive maps. That's really cool. Yeah, I always wonder that when people have these different player boards or asymmetry in the games, and like how that impacts the whole process of like play testing and how you decide how many you were going to have, and
Well, and it makes it really hard too because there's 20 unique factions in Apiary and then the 5 hive mats, and so all of a sudden you're starting to get a lot of orders of magnitude in figuring out just how to play test all of these combinations. And so that's actually part of the reason, we've gotten a lot of questions like, why are there only 5 hive mats? Why do you have 20 factions and only 5 hive mats? Part of it was because I started the factions a long time ago. I had the factions in it when I first pitched the game to Stonemaier. But part of it is that we wanted to make sure that all 20 factions could work with all of the hive mats. And so you needed to have the hive mats within a fairly narrowly constrained universe. Obviously some of them are going to work better or worse with different factions. That's just kind of fundamental. But we wanted to make sure that there weren't any abilities or combinations that just didn't work. And that's a difficult puzzle. And that's part of the reason why we only have the 5 hive mats.
Yeah, I can't even imagine if you had like more than that with all of the different factions, But yeah, that makes sense. So how did you and or like Jamie at Stonemaier team, how did you guys know that the game was finished and ready to like launch for pre-order?
Yeah. So it's hard, right? And I think that if you talk with any designer, they're going to say their game's never done. I think you could work on it until the end of time, but they've been doing this a long time, and I think for them, they wait until they try to get the playtest scores up to a certain point. Both numerically and also what the playtester feedback is saying. And I do think you get a sense of like each iteration, the changes get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so I think the last couple of waves of playtesting, all we were really doing is changing some of the numerical values. Like, okay, this should cost 2 honey instead of 3 honey, or 3 honey instead of 2 honey, or this should be worth 4 points instead of 3 points. That kind of stuff. And so once you do a couple of rounds of that, it's probably about done. Again, you could keep tweaking until the very end of time, and you're never going to get it perfect. But, and as an aside, one kind of game design side note is one of the tricky things with Apiary is a lot of the numbers are actually fairly small. So you're dealing with 1 honey, 2 honey, or 3 honey for the kind of the big victory point buildings. And that's actually a little bit difficult. You sort of see why some of these games start giving you, 17.5 points for something like that, is because obviously like, the smaller the numbers that you're working with, the coarser the designations are. And so there are a lot of situations where you have like one of these tiles and it's like, it costs 2 honey and it gives you 4 points per something. And you can't quite go to 5 and you can't quite go to 3, but 4 isn't quite right. And there's just like not a way to get it to line up. And that's sort of an interesting puzzle that obviously the higher you go, the higher the base numbers go, the more kind of nuance
flexibility.
You can have in that scoring.
Yeah.
Side note.
that that is really interesting to think about. But is this your first design, or your first signed design?
No, this is my first design. So I just kind of stumbled into something and rolled with it and got lucky and tried to make the most of it, basically.
That is so awesome. Congratulations again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I didn't say congratulations yet, but congratulations. That's really awesome. Do you have any advice for someone out there who might be interested in designing a worker placement game?
Yeah, a lot of it's just kind of general game design advice, and that's like find a community. There's a lot of really great communities online. Cardboard Edison does a lot of really cool stuff. Break My Game does a lot of really cool stuff. Find something in person if you can, but otherwise, find an online group. I really think that is the number one thing, because there are so many tips and tricks that you learn as you're a designer, and it's hard to figure them out on your own. So learning from others is key. In terms of worker placement games in particular, I would say figure out what you want the game to feel like. Do you want it to be a traditional worker placement game? Because a lot of the sort of more kind of traditional worker placement games are incredibly restrictive, and they can be incredibly punishing. And that's a real big part of the game. If you think about something like Agricola, if you need those wood and you don't get those wood, like, ooh, you're gonna be in it for a rough time. And so, is that the feeling that you want to go for in the game, or do you want something that's a bit more flexible? And if you want something more flexible, there's a lot of like the bump mechanism. I think a lot of the Shem Phillips games are just amazing. If you think of like Raiders of the North Sea or Architects of the West Kingdom, are doing lots of really interesting things with worker placement where you're not really locked out of any spots. And so that's kind of decision number one. And then you can sort of go from there based on how you want the game to feel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And yeah, there are so many different styles of worker placement out there these days.
Yeah, and I put a shout out for dice placement too. It's one of my favorite mechanisms. And Apiary is sort of dice placement, except you don't ever roll them. So I don't know.
Right. No, that's a good point. Awesome. Well, Connie, thanks so much for joining me today on Cardboard Creations. It's like I always love hearing backstories of board games. This one, again, like I said, like when I heard about bees in outer space, I was like, "What is this all about?" So it's really cool. It's really cool to hear the backstory for Apiary. Is there anything else that you're working on for Apiary, and or is there anything else you're working on that you like to mention? Anything with dragons?
Yeah, just a little game with dragons. So for Apiary, I am working on an expansion. They haven't really released any more information than that, but I am working on an expansion, so I'm very, very excited about that. And then
Sweet.
obviously Wormspan. Wormspan was just announced. It's YRM Span, which is obviously a spinoff of Wingspan. And that
Yeah.
was a project that I've been working on for about 2 years now. And I'm really, really excited for people to get to play it. I think it will be very familiar to those who know Wingspan. It uses the same kind of in this case, you're putting dragons onto a player mat, and then every dragon that you play increases your player mat, and then you're kind of building an engine that way. But there's a lot of new elements too. I mean, it was built completely ground up. Elizabeth served as a developer on the game, and so she had a lot of
Cool.
kind of input. But I think there's a lot of unique elements too. I mean, all of the dragons are completely different than the bird cards. You have this kind of dragon guild, essentially a track that you're going around and you're competing with other players. You have to excavate your tunnels first, so it's kind of a multi-layered process. And then I would say too, for folks
Wow.
who know Apiary and have played Apiary, I obviously really like combos as a player. Like combo building is kind of like the thing that I like as a player, and so I incorporated a lot of that into Wormspan too. And so I think you'll find that comes through for better or for worse. And
Awesome.
then yeah, so I could kind of keep going, but that's kind of the gist of Wormspan, and that'll be going on sale I think at the end of the month and shipping right away because that's kind of what Stonemaier does. So
Yeah. Oh, that is so exciting. Like a double
it's
header
very
here.
exciting. Yeah, terrifying, but exciting.
Awesome, Connie. Well, thank you again so much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. So thank you.
Thank you all for watching Cardboard Creations. Hopefully, it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it. Boom.